The small diner nestled at the corner of Broad Street and Magnolia Avenue had never been much to look at. Its peeling paint, the dim glow of the flickering neon sign that read Marcy's Diner, did little to draw in passers-by. But for LaToya, this place was home. Despite its unremarkable appearance, the scent of sizzling bacon, the rich aroma of fresh coffee, and the warmth inside had a magnetic pull. It was her second home, a place where the world felt a little smaller, a little more familiar. LaToya had worked here for 7 years. The pay was never enough to count on, but she took pride in the way she treated every customer, like family. It was what she did best. LaToya was known for her smile that could brighten even the most grumpy mornings, and for an intuition she didn't know she had. The ability to sense when someone was struggling, even when they didn't speak a word. The morning shifts were hers, often starting before the sun even thought about rising. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. She prepared the diner for the breakfast rush, her routine like clockwork. Mr. Harper, the boss, ran the place with an iron grip, always reminding the staff that time was money. To him, every minute spent in conversation with a customer, offering a little extra warmth, was a minute wasted. It was a Thursday. The frenetic energy of the morning rush had settled. The diner was quieter now, the hum of conversation replaced by the clink of dishes and the occasional sizzle from the kitchen. LaToya had barely finished refilling the coffee pots when the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a new customer. He wasn't like the regulars who filled the booths or hunched over counters, sipping coffee and reading their newspapers. No, this man was different. His suit was sharp, but wrinkled, his tie loose and askew. His appearance alone marked him as someone out of place, someone who didn't belong here. And yet it was more than that. He looked lost. LaToya watched him from behind the counter as he stood in the doorway, eyes darting nervously over the room. He didn't seem sure of himself, or of where to sit, before his gaze finally rested on a booth in the corner. He moved slowly, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him with every step. There was something in his demeanor, a quiet desperation perhaps, that tugged at her. It wasn't typical. It wasn't common, but something told her he needed more than just a meal. With a soft breath, LaToya grabbed a menu and made her way to his table. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly, offering him the menu with a friendly smile. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" The man looked up, his eyes tired, his face drawn and pale, as though sleep had been a long-forgotten luxury. "Just water, please," he whispered. His voice was faint, barely above a murmur. LaToya nodded and returned shortly with a glass of water, placing it gently in front of him. "Take your time," she said, her voice quiet but filled with genuine care. "If you need anything, just let me know." As she walked back toward the counter, she caught the sharp glare of Mr. Harper. He was watching her, his eyes narrowing in disapproval. "LaToya," he called, his voice cold and cutting. "We don't have time to cater to loiterers. If he's not ordering, he needs to leave." Her stomach knotted at the sound of his voice. He was always quick to judge, always so focused on what was efficient, what made money. He didn't care about people, not really. To him, they were all just numbers. But LaToya couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just a customer. There was something more. "He's just deciding," LaToya said, her tone calm, careful not to provoke him further. She didn't want to escalate things. Mr. Harper's eyes flashed with impatience. "You've got tables to clean. Focus on the paying customers, LaToya." The word stung. She bit her lip, turning away. But she couldn't stop herself from feeling the injustice in the air. Something about this man, the way he carried himself, his isolation. She couldn't just ignore him. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be dismissed without a second thought. She wouldn't do that to him. As time passed, she found small ways to show him kindness. When his glass of water ran low, she refilled it without waiting for him to ask. When she noticed him fidgeting with his tie, she slipped over a napkin and said softly, "You look like you've had a rough morning. Let me know if I can get you something warm." He met her gaze then, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. For a moment, it felt like a weight had lifted from him, and the air between them felt a little easier, a little lighter. He ordered a small breakfast, just toast and scrambled eggs, and ate in silence. LaToya didn't press him. She just kept an eye on him, ready to help if he needed it. When he finished, he stood, reaching into his pocket. His hand came up empty, and his face turned red, embarrassment flooding his features. I seem to have forgotten my wallet," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Before Mr. Harper could say a word, LaToya stepped forward. "It's okay," she said quickly, brushing off the tension. "I've got this one." The man's eyes widened in surprise. I can't let you, he protested. LaToya smiled and shrugged. It's just eggs and toast. Consider it a kindness. He studied her for a long moment, searching her face as if trying to understand her motives. Finally his voice cracked, a whisper of sincerity in his words. Thank you. Truly. LaToya nodded, brushing it off like it was no big deal, even though it meant everything to her in that moment. But as the man turned to leave, she felt the weight of Mr. Harper's gaze. His eyes burned into her, and she knew what was coming. LaToya. His voice was ice cold. My office. Now. She followed him into the cramped office at the back of the diner, the walls lined with old photographs, dusty shelves full of invoices long forgotten. The stale smell of coffee and frustration lingered in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Mr. Harper wasted no time. What were you thinking, giving that man a free meal? His voice was a blade, cutting through the low hum of the diner. You know we can't afford to hand out charity here. LaToya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her arms crossed over her chest, not backing down. He looked like he needed help, she said, her voice steady. It wasn't a big deal. Mr. Harper's face contorted with anger. Not a big deal? Do you think this place runs on good intentions? You're here to work, not play savior. Her cheeks burned with anger, but she kept her voice even. I don't see how a plate of eggs and toast is going to bankrupt the diner. He slammed his hand on the desk, fury erupting. That's not the point. You undermined me in front of a customer, and now you're arguing with me? This isn't your personal charity operation, LaToya. If you can't follow the rules, maybe you don't belong here. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. LaToya's heart raced, and she felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of years spent here, doing the right thing in a place that didn't care. She looked at him, her voice quiet but resolute. Fine. If that's how you feel, I'll go. Mr. Harper blinked, clearly caught off guard. You're fired, he said after a pause, his voice calmer but still cutting. Pack up your things. You can pick up your final paycheck at the end of the week. LaToya nodded, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. She turned and walked out of the office, head held high, leaving behind the diner and the man who had only ever seen her as expendable. The other staff watched in stunned silence as she grabbed her bag and coat, her exit dignified and silent. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The air outside was cold and biting, but LaToya didn't notice. As she walked away from the diner, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. She'd lost her job, all for a simple act of kindness. Anger bubbled within her, but beneath it, a quiet sense of resolve began to form. She'd done what she believed was right. No one could take that away. The walk home was long, the streets familiar but distant. Her small apartment, nestled above a laundromat, waited for her. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The place was modest, just enough for her and her cat Smokey. As she climbed the stairs to the door, her legs felt heavier, each step a reminder of what she'd just lost. Inside, Smokey greeted her with a soft meow, winding between her legs as she kicked off her shoes. LaToya sank into the couch, her head in her hands. She replayed the morning in her mind, second-guessing every choice. Had she done the right thing? Could she have handled it differently? The doubts gnawed at her, but deep down, she knew she couldn't have turned her back on that man. She couldn't have ignored the pain in his eyes. Later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of bills and unanswered questions pressed down on her. Rent was due in 2 weeks. She didn't know how she was going to make it work, but somehow she would, because she knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, she would always choose kindness. LaToya didn't have a backup plan. No contingency. No safety net. Yet deep in her heart, she knew this couldn't be the end of her story. There had to be more to it. The next morning, the sharp rays of early sunlight broke through her curtains, stirring her from an uneasy sleep. She was determined to figure out her next step. Her fingers wrapped around the coffee pot, steady and resolute. But just as she poured herself a cup, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. She froze. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't expecting anyone. The rhythmic sound of her heartbeat grew louder in her ears as she set the coffee mug down, each movement slower than the last. Who could it be? Tentatively, she approached the door. The familiar creak of the old hinges seemed louder than usual as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. There he was, the man from the diner. But he wasn't the disheveled figure from the previous day. Gone was the lost, weary look. This man stood tall now, his suit sharp and pristine, the wrinkles from yesterday replaced by a clean, confident appearance. His face, once troubled, was now calm, even serious. He held a small envelope in his hand, extending it towards her like an olive branch. Good morning. His voice was steady, warm. I owe you an explanation. I owe you everything. Latoya's first instinct was to close the door, slam it shut, and pretend nothing had happened. Anger bubbled beneath her skin, but she stopped herself. It wasn't anger she felt, not exactly. It was something else. She could see it in his eyes, something raw, something sincere. But still, the shock of his sudden reappearance made her hesitate. "May I come in?" he asked, his hand offering the envelope, a silent plea for understanding. Latoya glanced at the envelope, then back at him. She thought for a moment. Could she trust him? After a beat of silence, she stepped aside, still cautious, still unsure. "Sure," she said, her voice hesitant. "But I hope you're not here to apologize for what happened. That wasn't your fault." He walked in, his presence filling the space. The room was modest, simple but tidy. Latoya had made it her sanctuary. Smokey, her curious tabby, padded over to investigate the newcomer. Jonathan crouched slightly, extending his hand toward the cat with a small smile. "Friendly little guy," he said, his tone soft, as if trying to bridge the distance between them with something small, familiar. Latoya folded her arms, watching him carefully, still trying to make sense of this unexpected turn of events. She broke the silence, the edge in her voice a bit sharper now. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but why are you here?" He straightened up, his smile fading, replaced by something more serious. "First," he began, "let me introduce myself properly. My name is Jonathan Reeves." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "And before I explain, I need you to understand something. What you did yesterday, it meant more to me than you could ever imagine." Latoya frowned, her skepticism rising. "I just brought you eggs and toast," she said, her voice guarded. "It wasn't anything special." Jonathan shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "You treated me like a human being when I felt like nothing. Do you know how rare that is?" Latoya's mind raced. What was he talking about? She shook her head slowly, the disbelief clear in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his shoulders stiffening slightly, as he prepared to share something deeper. "Yesterday," he began, "I wasn't just some random guy walking into a diner. I was testing something, an experiment, if you will." "An experiment?" Latoya echoed, her voice incredulous. "What kind of experiment?" "I'm a businessman," Jonathan explained, his eyes now piercing into hers with an intensity that demanded her attention. "I own several companies across the country, but recently, I've been hearing the same thing over and over. People telling me how disconnected I've become, how out of touch I am with the struggles of everyday life." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So I decided to see for myself. I left my wallet at home, dressed down, and visited places like your diner. I wanted to observe how people would treat someone who looked like they had nothing to offer." Latoya's eyes widened in shock. "So you were pretending?" Her voice rose, the disbelief turning into something sharper. "This was all a game to you?" "No," Jonathan replied quickly, shaking his head. "It was never about tricking anyone. It was about finding people who still believe in kindness. People who would help without expecting anything in return." His gaze softened. "And you, Latoya, you were that person." Her stomach churned. Part of her felt flattered, but another part of her was furious. How dare he turn something so genuine into some kind of experiment? Jonathan reached into the envelope he had been holding and pulled out a check. He handed it to her, the weight of the paper heavy in her hand as she stared down at the amount written on it. The number was so large, so impossible, that her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "It is," Jonathan said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not just a thank you. It's an investment in you. I believe you have something special, and I want to help you use it." Latoya stared at the check, her mind a whirlwind. Part of her screamed to reject it, to stand tall and walk away from this offer. She wasn't the type to take handouts. But deep down, the part of her that had lain awake the night before, worrying about rent and bills, part of her knew she couldn't ignore this lifeline. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, the weight of the decision sinking in. "Say yes," Jonathan said, his voice firm but kind. "Let me help you build something better for yourself. You deserve it." Latoya sank onto the couch, her hands still gripping the check, her fingers trembling as if it might slip away. Smokey, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room, nuzzled against her arm, a small comfort in the midst of everything. Jonathan settled across from her, his expression calm, but his eyes were full of earnestness. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, his voice low and understanding. "And I don't expect you to make any decisions right now, but I want you to know why I'm doing this." Latoya finally raised her eyes to meet his, her voice steady now, but still soft. "Why me?" she asked, her words barely a whisper. "There are so many people who need help more than I do." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because you didn't see me as a problem to be solved," he said, his words slow but powerful. "You didn't look at me like I was beneath you. You just helped, no questions, no judgment. Just kindness. That's rare, Latoya. And it's something the world needs more of." Her heart raced as his words hit her. She thought back to the countless moments at the diner, helping coworkers, slipping a few dollars into a struggling busboy's tip jar. It had never seemed like a big deal to her. It was just who she was. But now, sitting across from Jonathan, she realized those small acts of kindness had ripples she could never have foreseen. Finally, she asked, her voice steadier now, "What is it you want me to do?" Jonathan smiled, a look of relief washing over his face. "That's up to you," he said. "This isn't a loan, and it's not a contract. It's a gift. But if you're willing, I'd like to help you figure out how to use it in a way that makes a difference." Latoya blinked, her thoughts momentarily stilled by his unwavering sincerity. "You really mean that?" The words felt heavy on her tongue, filled with doubt and disbelief. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I do," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. But then he added, "I have one suggestion, something to think about." His eyes locked onto hers, waiting for her response. "Have you ever thought about starting your own business?" The laugh that escaped Latoya was brief, but it carried the weight of her disbelief. "Me? A business?" She shook her head, her voice hollow. "I don't even know where to start." Jonathan's gaze softened, his words gentle yet filled with quiet conviction. "That's where I come in." He paused for a moment, letting his offer linger in the air. "I have resources, connections, experience. If you're willing to take the leap, I'll guide you every step of the way." Latoya's mind raced, the possibility of a dream she'd never dared to voice suddenly blooming before her. She thought of the things she'd once longed for but dismissed as unattainable. A catering business, a community center, even a program to help others find their footing. These ideas had always felt like distant stars, out of reach. But now, for the first time, they didn't seem entirely impossible. Yet, despite the stirring excitement inside her, a part of her hesitated. "I don't want to feel like I owe you," she said, her tone careful, a protective wall forming around her heart. Jonathan's expression softened with understanding. "You won't," he reassured her, his voice steady. "The only thing I ask is that you stay true to who you are. Use this gift to help others, just as you helped me. That's all." Latoya sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the check still gripped in her hands, the weight of it almost too much to bear. She thought of the diner, the long shifts, the disapproving gaze of Mr. Harper, his dismissive attitude toward her kindness. She thought of Jonathan, this man who had walked into her life like a stranger and yet, in an instant, had seen something in her that she couldn't even recognize in herself. And then she thought of her future, the one she had dreamed of but never had the courage to chase. Finally, Latoya looked up, a spark of determination flickering in her eyes. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Jonathan kept his word, meeting with her regularly, helping her turn her dreams into something tangible. They mapped out a plan, step by step, breathing life into the ideas that had once seemed like fantasies. After endless brainstorming sessions, late nights, and relentless encouragement, Latoya knew the direction she had to take. She would create a community cafe, a space that wasn't just about serving meals, but about offering a safe haven for people in need. A place where job seekers could find workshops, where financial literacy could be taught, and where people could come together for support. Jonathan's financial backing and connections turned what seemed like a pipe dream into reality. The space they secured wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Enough to house her vision. Contractors got to work, transforming the space into a cozy yet functional hub, and Latoya threw herself into the work. Every free moment was spent planning menus, hiring staff, and spreading the word. When the grand opening finally arrived, Latoya stood in the middle of her bustling cafe, overwhelmed by the sight before her. The place was alive with energy, filled with people from every walk of life. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had heard her story. The air buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the irresistible scent of freshly brewed coffee and pastries. Jonathan stood off to the side, his quiet smile watching over her, a silent assurance that she had found her place. Latoya moved through the crowd, greeting each guest with the warmth and kindness that had always defined her. She no longer needed his guidance. She was no longer that uncertain woman from the diner. She was exactly where she was meant to be, As the evening wore on, LaToya took a moment to address the crowd, standing near the counter, her heart beating with emotion. Her voice was steady, but filled with vulnerability as she spoke. A year ago, she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. I was just a waitress at a diner. I thought that was all I'd ever be. But sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes, a small act of kindness can lead to something bigger than you ever imagined. She paused, her eyes settling on Jonathan. I learned that kindness isn't a weakness. It's a strength, and it has the power to change lives, not just for the person receiving it, but for the person giving it. The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, LaToya's heart swelled with gratitude. She had doubted herself so many times, but now, standing in the midst of her community, surrounded by love and support, she knew she had made the right choice. As the night drew to a close, Jonathan approached her, his voice low but filled with pride. You've done something incredible here, LaToya. She met his gaze, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. He shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little push. LaToya smiled, her heart full of gratitude. Well, thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Jonathan tipped his head, glancing around at the lively cafe, the energy buzzing around them. You're going to help a lot of people here. I hope you realize that. LaToya nodded, her voice soft but resolute. I do. And I'm ready. The cafe soon became a cornerstone of the community. It wasn't just a place for meals. It was a place for second chances, for growth, for connection. People came for more than just food. They came for the sense of belonging, the reassurance that they weren't alone. For LaToya, it was proof that staying true to her values, kindness, compassion, and resilience, was the greatest gift she could give not only to herself, but to everyone who walked through her doors.